The flight attendant's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding, demanding attention from every passenger in the cabin. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the plane or I will call security." Her words, laced with condescension, hung heavily in the space between them. The tension was suffocating. A hush fell over the cabin as eyes darted toward the confrontation, curiosity and discomfort flickering across the faces of those watching. Serena Caldwell, a poised black woman in her late 30s, remained seated, her expression unreadable. She slowly looked up at the attendant, her deep brown eyes calm, unwavering. "I've already told you," she said, her voice steady, firm, unshaken by the woman's hostility. "I'm not moving." The response was simple, almost soothing, yet there was an undeniable strength in her words. It was a quiet defiance, one that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. This was not a woman who could be intimidated. The flight attendant, Brooke Lancaster, clenched her jaw, frustration flashing across her face. She had expected quick compliance, perhaps a meek apology, but instead she was met with an unshakable force. Serena could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the silent judgment of the onlookers, the unspoken rules that people like Brooke wielded over people like her, but she refused to shrink under it. She had been humiliated in front of everyone, but what they didn't realize, what no one saw coming, was that the woman they assumed was powerless was about to show them exactly who she was. And when she did, the entire plane would never forget it. If you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their background, click the subscribe button now and tell us where you're watching from. The private jet gleamed under the golden afternoon sun, its sleek design promising an experience of pure luxury. Inside, the cabin was a world of opulence, plush leather seats, gold accents, and the quiet hum of soft ambient music. It was the kind of setting where wealth and exclusivity wrapped themselves around every moment. Passengers moved about leisurely, their expensive luggage rolling smoothly as they settled in, some scrolling through their devices, others sipping champagne from crystal glasses. The atmosphere was serene, until an unspoken tension began to ripple beneath the surface. Serena Caldwell stepped into the cabin with a quiet confidence, her presence commanding yet effortless. Dressed in a perfectly tailored midnight blue blazer and matching slacks, she exuded an air of understated power. She moved with grace, not seeking attention, yet drawing it effortlessly. This wasn't just another flight for Serena. It was a journey to oversee the continued expansion of her empire, a fact that no one on board, not even the flight crew, was yet aware of. And for now, she preferred it that way. Standing near the entrance, Brooke Lancaster scanned the boarding passengers with practiced precision. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture stiff with control. She took pride in maintaining order on the plane, but her version of order had always depended on how a person looked, how they carried themselves, and more importantly, whether she deemed them worthy of her respect. As Serena stepped forward, Brooke's professional smile dimmed slightly, her welcoming tone noticeably cooler. "Welcome aboard," she said curtly. Behind Serena, an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, entered the cabin with ease. The couple, seasoned travelers, carried the air of those accustomed to first-class luxury. Mrs. Donovan clutched a delicate knitting bag, her fingers already itching to begin her work. Mr. Donovan, dressed in a crisp linen suit, held a folded newspaper in one hand, his sharp eyes scanning the plane. Brooke's demeanor shifted instantly, her posture straightened, her smile widened, her tone warmed. "Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, lovely to have you with us again." Serena noticed the stark difference, though her expression remained neutral. Her keen eyes missed nothing, the way Brooke's voice softened for the Donovans, the extra warmth in her tone. It was subtle, but unmistakable. As passengers settled in, Brooke made her rounds, ensuring everything was in place. She checked in on the Donovans, her voice dripping with courtesy. "Is there anything I can get for you before takeoff?" Mrs. Donovan shook her head politely, already immersed in her knitting. Mr. Donovan nodded toward his coffee, indicating his satisfaction. Then Brooke passed Serena. Her steps slowed. She glanced at the neatly placed bag under Serena's seat, her lips pressing into a thin line. Unlike with the others, there was no question of comfort, no offering of service. She simply walked by, her expression unreadable but her actions deliberate. Serena noticed. She always noticed. The difference in treatment was as clear as the view from the jet's oversized windows. But she had faced worse than this. Much worse. And Brooke Lancaster had no idea who she had just chosen to underestimate. Have you ever experienced a shift in someone's attitude based solely on appearances? Share your experience in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Have you ever been judged before someone even knew your story? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories. Madeline Hart, a woman in her early 40s, carried herself with the rigid precision of someone who thrived on authority. Everything about her was meticulously curated, from the crispness of her uniform to the sleek, flawless waves of her auburn hair. To Madeline, order wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. And order in her world was dictated by appearances. Her eyes narrowed as she observed Elise Bennett, a poised black woman who had settled comfortably into a first-class seat. Something about Elise unsettled her. It wasn't her attire, perfectly tailored slacks and a sophisticated navy blazer. It was her presence. She exuded a quiet confidence, a self-assurance that didn't demand attention yet commanded it effortlessly. And Madeline didn't like that, because in her mind, Elise didn't belong here. With quick, purposeful strides, Madeline approached, her lips pressing into a tight, artificial smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone laced with forced politeness, the condescension barely concealed. "I believe you're in the wrong section." Elise looked up, her deep brown eyes meeting Madeline's with an unreadable expression. Calm, collected, unmoved. "I believe this is my seat," Elise responded evenly, her voice steady and composed. Madeline's smile didn't waver, but her tone sharpened ever so slightly. "I don't think so," she said, folding her arms. "This section is reserved for our elite passengers." A subtle shift rippled through the cabin. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension. A well-dressed socialite sitting nearby leaned in slightly, her curiosity piqued. Across the aisle, a businessman in an expensive suit frowned, his attention now fully on the exchange. Elise remained poised, her gaze unwavering. "You might want to double-check your passenger list before making assumptions," she said, her voice calm but firm. Madeline's eyebrows lifted in mild irritation. A flicker of frustration flashed in her steel-blue eyes. "I don't need to check anything," she shot back. "I know who belongs here and who." The atmosphere in the cabin thickened, the air buzzing with unspoken tension. Some passengers exchanged uncertain glances, whispering among themselves. Others, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them, averted their gazes, pretending not to notice. A voice muttered from a few rows back, "Why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong seat?" Another shrugged, probably trying to sneak in for a free upgrade. Madeline's stance hardened. She wasn't going to let this turn into a debate. "If you don't move to the back of the plane," she announced, her voice rising just enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I'll have to call security." Elise tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Call whoever you need to," she said smoothly, her voice unwavering, "but I'm not moving." A collective inhale passed through the cabin. The socialite gasped softly, watching the scene unfold like a drama she hadn't expected to witness. The businessman leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowed in disapproval. Madeline's jaw tightened. This was not how she expected this to go. Her frustration mounting, she turned sharply toward the junior flight attendant standing near the galley. Grace, a young woman who had been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort. "Grace," Madeline snapped, her voice clipped with authority, "escort her to the back, now." Grace hesitated. She glanced between Elise and Madeline, uncertainty flickering across her face. Should she say something? Elise had suggested checking the passenger list, and wasn't that standard procedure? But Madeline's glare was cold, unyielding, a silent warning. Grace swallowed hard, her hands tightening at her sides. Reluctantly, she nodded and stepped forward. Elise shifted slightly in her seat, her demeanor unchanged. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than Madeline anticipated. Madeline let out a scoffing breath, waving off the warning. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she retorted. "Now get up." But Elise didn't move. She didn't so much as flinch. And that's when it happened. Something shifted in the energy of the cabin. The power dynamic, once tilted in Madeline's favor, suddenly felt uncertain. Elise's composure, her unshaken presence, was starting to unnerve her. For the first time, Madeline felt something she wasn't used to feeling. Doubt. What would you do if someone treated you like this on a flight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're captivated by this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more powerful narratives. The cabin was deathly silent, the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. Every passenger was transfixed, their gazes bouncing between the two women, locked in an unspoken battle. Isabel Drake, the lead flight attendant, stood rigid, her arms crossed over her chest, her carefully polished smirk barely concealing the simmering frustration beneath. Across from her, Celeste Monroe, a poised and elegantly dressed black woman, remained seated, her expression unreadable, her presence unwavering. "You shouldn't make assumptions about people," Celeste said quietly, her voice carrying a calm certainty that only deepened Isabel's irritation. Isabel scoffed, her smirk widening. "And you shouldn't be in seats you didn't pay for." A flicker of amusement passed through Celeste's gaze, as if she already knew how this would end. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for her phone. The glow of the screen briefly illuminated her face as she typed a quick message before setting it back down on the armrest. "You're making a mistake," she said simply. Her words were neither a threat nor a plea. They were a fact. Isabel's confidence faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then, recovering, she rolled her eyes. "We'll see about that," she muttered, her irritation spilling over into her actions. She shot a glance at Grace, the junior flight attendant standing anxiously nearby. "Escort her to the back, now." Grace hesitated, her fingers twitched toward the passenger list clipped by the cockpit door, her conscience screaming at her to double-check. But before she could act, Isabel's sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "Grace, what are you doing?" Grace swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just checking." "I said, I have this under control," Isabel snapped, her eyes narrowing. "You don't need to get involved." Grace's face flushed with embarrassment as she shrank back. Torn between what was right and the fear of losing her job, she lowered her gaze and stepped aside. But the passengers had seen enough. A man seated across the aisle, a distinguished businessman in a crisp navy suit, leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing in disapproval. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "Excuse me," he said, directing his words to Celeste, but making sure Isabel heard him. "Is everything all right?" Celeste turned, offering him a polite, appreciative nod. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice steady but warm. Before the businessman could say another word, Isabel spun on him, her tone clipped and accusing. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disturbance." The businessman arched a brow. "From where I'm sitting," he said smoothly, "you're the one making a scene." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. A well-dressed woman, 2 rows ahead, clearly a socialite, leaned toward her companion, whispering just loudly enough to be heard. "Looks like she's trying to sneak in for a free ride." Isabel seized on the comment instantly, her smirk returning. "That's exactly what it looks like," she said, folding her arms and addressing the other passengers as though rallying them to her side. "We have rules for a reason. Some people just don't respect them. Celeste remained motionless, her gaze unwavering, her silence speaking louder than words. Grace, meanwhile, took a tentative step toward the passenger list again, her hands shaking. She knew something wasn't right. She felt it. But Isabel caught the movement in her peripheral vision. "Grace," she snapped, her patience shredding, "what do you think you're doing?" Grace hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just checking." "I told you I have this under control," Isabel cut her off, her voice razor-sharp. Grace's shoulders tensed as she reluctantly stepped back. Across the cabin, the businessman shook his head in disbelief. "You're out of line," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Isabel's face flushed with anger. "I've had enough of this," she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "Either you move or I'll make sure you're escorted off this plane." Celeste finally met her gaze, her expression cool and unreadable. "You can try," she said softly. The words sent a visible shiver of unease through Isabel, though she refused to acknowledge it. With a sharp huff, she turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, her polished heels clicking furiously against the carpet. Passengers whispered among themselves, eyes flicking between Celeste and Isabel's retreating form. The businessman leaned back in his seat, shaking his head, while Grace stood frozen in place, her hands clenched at her sides. Celeste, still perfectly composed, reached for the book in her lap and flipped a page, as though nothing had happened. Minutes passed, the tension lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. Isabel returned, her tray balanced with near-empty glasses of sparkling water. Her professional demeanor was intact, but her expression was tight with unresolved irritation. She moved through the aisle, stopping at every seat but one. Celeste's. The neglect was obvious. Celeste waited patiently, her gaze following Isabel as she served an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hartford first, then another passenger further back. When Isabel finally passed by, without so much as a glance in her direction, Celeste's voice broke the silence. "Excuse me," she said gently, "could I have some water, please?" For a brief moment, Isabel hesitated. Then, slowly, she turned. Their eyes met again. And this time Isabel had the sinking feeling that she had just made another mistake. Isabel paused, her lips curling into a barely concealed smirk as she cast a dismissive glance at Celeste. "I'll get to you when I can," she said curtly, pivoting on her heel and striding away without another word. Celeste's steady gaze followed Isabel's retreating figure, her expression unreadable. She didn't react, didn't call her back, but there was something in the quiet way she watched that unsettled those who noticed. Would you have spoken up if you saw this happening? Or would you have stayed silent? Let us know in the comments below. Minutes ticked by, the tension simmering beneath the surface. Celeste shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting for comfort. Absent-mindedly, she extended one leg ever so slightly into the aisle, unaware that her simple movement would soon be twisted into something much darker. Isabel returned, the tray balanced in her hands, her eyes scanning the aisle. Then she saw it, Celeste's leg barely crossing into her path. A normal person would have asked her to move, but Isabel wasn't looking for reason, she was looking for power. With a sharp, calculated step, Isabel deliberately changed her course. The impact was swift. Her foot struck Celeste's leg with unnecessary force, sending the tray tilting dangerously. In an instant, glasses of water tumbled forward, cascading down in a chilling splash, drenching Celeste's lap and pooling onto the floor. Gasps rippled through the cabin as Isabel gasped theatrically, clutching the tray as if she had been the one wronged. "Watch where you're putting your legs," she snapped, her voice sharp and piercing. "You've caused a mess." Heads turned, eyes locked onto Celeste, then back at Isabel. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, frowning. A well-dressed socialite leaned forward, whispering to her companion with barely hidden intrigue. Celeste, however, remained still. Slowly she brushed her hands over her damp trousers, dabbing at the water. When she finally looked up at Isabel, her expression was calm. "But you walked into me," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. A flicker of uncertainty passed through Isabel's features, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. Celeste tilted her head slightly, her eyes unwavering. "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else," she continued, her voice smooth but carrying an undeniable weight. "And, if that's too much to ask, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words hung heavy in the air, a quiet, powerful rebuke that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Isabel's face flushed an angry shade of red. She stepped closer, her nails digging into the tray she still held. Her breath came out in sharp bursts as she seethed, barely keeping her composure. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she hissed, her voice low, laced with venom. Then, in a shocking instant, she lost control. Before anyone could react, Isabel's hand whipped through the air. The crack of the slap was deafening. A collective gasp surged through the plane. Time seemed to freeze. The businessman halfway across the aisle stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The socialite's perfectly painted lips parted in shock. Grace, the junior flight attendant, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Celeste didn't move. Her head had turned slightly from the impact, but she didn't touch her face. Her hands remained calmly on her lap. She exhaled slowly, then turned back to face Isabel, her expression unreadable. But her eyes, they carried a weight that made Isabel hesitate for the first time. A deadly silence choked the air. The tension was thick, suffocating. Then Celeste spoke. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the cabin like a knife. Passengers held their breath. What would you do if you were in Celeste's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're hooked on this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe now. Celeste's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "I've been patient with you," she continued, her voice measured, deliberate, "but your behavior has crossed the line." Isabel's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists. "Crossed the line?" she snapped, her voice rising with defensiveness. "You're the one who's been disruptive since you got on this plane." Celeste didn't flinch. She didn't waver. Instead, she straightened her posture, her presence commanding without ever needing to raise her voice. "You'll regret that," Celeste said softly. The cabin seemed to shrink around them. Isabel hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Then," she scoffed, forcing out a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Regret it?" she sneered. "What are you going to do, call the police?" Celeste didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any threat she could have spoken. In the far corner, Grace, the younger flight attendant, had seen enough. She had watched Isabel's behavior escalate all day, her own discomfort growing with every passing moment. Now she knew. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Discreetly, Grace stepped away from the commotion, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She dialed a number, her voice hushed but firm when the call connected. "It's Grace," she said. Her fingers tightened around the device, her pulse racing. "We have a situation on the plane." The call connected and Serena's voice was hushed but steady. "It's Serena," she said, her tone firm but urgent. "We have a situation on the plane." She exhaled sharply, glancing over her shoulder before returning to her post, her stomach twisting with unease. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter, but her resolve remained firm. She had done the right thing. Now it was just a matter of time. Meanwhile, Claudia remained oblivious to the call, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface, barely contained, but something had shifted. The authority she once wielded like a weapon was slipping through her fingers, and she could feel it. Across from her, Elise sat motionless, untouched by the chaos unraveling around her. Water dripped onto her tailored slacks, but she made no move to brush it away. Her back remained straight, her gaze level, her presence an unshakable force against the storm brewing before her. Passengers watched, their eyes flickering between the two women. The air inside the cabin crackled with unspoken tension, each moment stretching longer than the last. No one knew what would happen next, but they all knew the situation was far from over. A woman seated nearby hesitated before leaning toward Elise, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" she asked, her concern genuine. Elise turned to her, offering a small but reassuring smile. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice smooth, unwavering. The silence in the cabin stretched, broken only by the low hum of the plane's engines. Elise finally lifted her gaze, fixing it on Claudia. Her voice was calm but edged with something undeniable. "All you had to do was treat me with respect," she said. "But instead, you let your prejudice decide who belongs and who doesn't." Claudia's grip on the tray tightened. Her knuckles whitened. The mocking smirk returned, but it no longer held the confidence it once did. "Respect?" she scoffed. "Maybe you should earn it first. People like you don't deserve my respect." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. Others exchanged looks, silently questioning how far this would go. Elise's expression didn't change. She exhaled slowly, letting Claudia's words hang in the air. Then, her tone sharpened. "You shouldn't have said that." Claudia rolled her eyes, folding her arms again. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "I've been more than patient with you. Maybe now you'll understand that actions have consequences." Elise's eyes narrowed slightly, her composure unbroken. Then, in a voice quieter, yet heavier than before, she replied, "You're right. Actions do have consequences." A chill rippled down Claudia's spine, an instinctive reaction she didn't fully understand. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her expression. But she quickly shoved it aside. "I'm the one in charge here," she snapped. "You're the one who's going to regret this." She turned on her heel, feigning confidence, but deep inside she felt something gnawing at her. Now, the weight of the passengers' stares, the hushed whispers, the way even Serena looked shaken. It all made her feel as though the walls of the plane were closing in. She forced herself to push forward, but her thoughts raced uncontrollably. What if this woman isn't who I think she is? There was something unsettling about the way Elise carried herself, the way she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't fought back, the way she had simply stared at her, as if she knew something Claudia didn't. For the first time, a sliver of fear cut through Claudia's arrogance. She glanced around the cabin, searching for someone to back her up, but found none. The businessman across the aisle glared at her, his arms crossed in silent judgment. The socialite, who had once smirked at Elise's predicament, now shook her head in disapproval. And Serena, the young flight attendant, stood frozen at the back of the plane, her hands clenched tightly around the passenger list. Elise, however, remained exactly where she was. She uncrossed her legs, shifting ever so slightly, then leaned back into her seat. Her posture exuded a quiet confidence, an undeniable power. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't have to do anything. Her silence alone said everything Claudia didn't want to hear. The unease settled deep in Claudia's chest. She had controlled this plane for years, dictated every interaction with a firm, unyielding grip. But now, something was different. And she hated it. As she struggled to regain her footing, Elise's voice echoed in her mind. "You're making a mistake." Claudia clenched her jaw. She had no idea just how big of a mistake it was. Because unbeknownst to her, Elise had already taken action. And her response to the slap wasn't submission. It was strategy. Trouble was brewing. And Claudia was about to find out just how much trouble she was really in. What do you think Elise should do next? Let us know in the comments below. If this story has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because things are about to get very interesting. Ariel's movements were measured as she reached for her phone, her fingers gliding across the screen with deliberate precision. She typed something quickly before setting the device on the armrest beside her. To an outsider, it was an insignificant gesture, an absent-minded action, perhaps, but there was something about the way she did it, something subtle yet unnerving, that made Claudia's stomach twist. The flight attendant's gaze flickered to the phone, then back to Ariel. A thin layer of unease settled over her. "What do you think you're doing?" Claudia demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. Ariel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, exuding an air of unshaken composure. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but the weight of her words pressed into the silence like a warning. "You'll find out soon enough." A ripple of unease passed through the cabin. The low hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the dead air that had fallen over the passengers. Conversations had turned into hushed whispers. A woman seated a few rows ahead, a socialite with a penchant for gossip, leaned toward her companion. Her voice was barely audible, but the disbelief in her tone was unmistakable. "Something's off." "Do you think she's someone important?" Across the aisle, a businessman sat in silence. His gaze locked onto Ariel with a look of quiet calculation. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, watching, as if he had already pieced together a truth that the others were just beginning to suspect. Then, the sound of footsteps. All heads turned as the cockpit door swung open and the pilot emerged. His expression was rigid, his movements purposeful as he strode down the aisle toward Claudia. Her irritation flared at the sight of him. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice clipped with impatience. "I have this under control." The pilot didn't waver. "Step aside," he said, his tone firm but carrying an edge of discomfort. Claudia stiffened. "Excuse me." She folded her arms, tilting her chin up in defiance. "Why would I need to step aside? I'm handling this situation." The pilot's gaze flicked to Ariel, then back to Claudia. When he spoke again, his words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. "I just received a call from management," he said plainly. "The owner of this plane is on board, and that would be Miss Carter." He gestured toward Ariel. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. "She owns the plane?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The businessman nodded knowingly, his expression unreadable. "I had a feeling," he murmured under his breath, as though the revelation only confirmed what he had already deduced. At the back of the cabin, Serena, who had been watching anxiously from her position near the galley, stood frozen in place, but this time the tension in her shoulders was replaced with a quiet relief. Ariel wasn't just another passenger. She was the power that ran this airline. Claudia, on the other hand, looked as though the ground had just been ripped from beneath her feet, her face drained of color, her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "That can't be right," she stammered, the sharpness in her voice gone, replaced by something weaker. "There must be some mistake." But the silence that followed only deepened her dread. The captain's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and prepare for descent." A murmur of confusion spread through the passengers. The businessman leaned slightly toward Ariel, lowering his voice. "Why are we landing?" Ariel didn't answer. She didn't have to. Claudia's confidence, once unshakable, was unraveling rapidly. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, her breath quickening. The plane touched down with smooth precision, taxiing to a private section of the tarmac, and then a sleek black SUV rolled up beside it. The doors swung open and two sharply dressed assistants stepped out. Their movements were fluid, efficient, and carried the unmistakable air of authority. They ascended the steps of the plane with ease, the weight of their presence shifting the energy in the cabin the moment they entered. "Miss Carter," one of them greeted warmly, their voice steeped in respect. "Everything is ready for your review." Passengers exchanged stunned glances. Claudia didn't move, couldn't move. Ariel remained seated for a moment longer, letting the weight of the moment settle over the plane. Then, with the same effortless grace she had maintained throughout the ordeal, she stood. She adjusted the hem of her blazer, her expression serene yet commanding. Then she finally spoke. her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm Ariel Carter," she said, letting the name sink into the silence. "Owner of this plane and CEO of this airline." Another wave of stunned murmurs crashed through the passengers. Claudia stumbled back slightly, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. The woman who she had dismissed, insulted, slapped, was the owner? Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Ariel turned to her, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Your behavior today has been nothing short of disgraceful," she stated. "You've humiliated yourself, mistreated a passenger, and damaged the reputation of my airline." Claudia's throat tightened. I didn't know," she stammered, desperate now. "If I had known—" "You didn't know," Ariel interrupted coolly, "because you didn't bother to treat me with the respect that every passenger deserves." Her words sliced through the tension like steel. Instead of apologies, Claudia had only excuses, but excuses wouldn't save her now. Ariel turned to the pilot. "I want this addressed immediately," she said. "And I want to make sure something like this never happens again." The pilot nodded professionally. "Understood, Ms. Carter." Claudia took a step back, her thoughts spiraling into panic. She looked toward the exit, her instinct screaming at her to leave before this got worse. But before she could move, one of the assistants stepped into her path, shaking his head. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Ariel's gaze remained steady. "Claudia," she said, her voice even but laced with finality, "you're fired." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Claudia's face crumpled. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to get caught," Ariel corrected, her tone unyielding. "But now, you'll face the consequences." At that moment, 2 uniformed police officers stepped onto the plane. Claudia's breath hitched as they approached. "Miss Carter," one of the officers addressed Ariel with measured professionalism. "We received your report. Are you pressing charges?" Ariel didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said firmly. "She assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. I expect her to be held accountable." The color drained from Claudia's face entirely. "Wait, wait," she cried, her voice shrill with desperation. "This is a misunderstanding." The officer didn't waver. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent." Claudia barely heard the rest. Her hands trembled as cold steel cuffs snapped around her wrists. And as she was led down the aisle, humiliated, powerless, the passengers watched. No one spoke, because justice had just landed, and Ariel Carter had made sure of it. Isabel Harrington took a slow, deliberate breath, her sharp gaze sweeping across the cabin. "I am the owner of this plane," she declared, her voice calm yet commanding, "and the CEO of this airline." The words struck like a thunderbolt. Claudia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The once confident, condescending flight attendant now stood frozen, her face drained of color, her bravado crumbling into sheer panic. Just moments ago, she had believed she held all the power. Now she realized too late that she had gravely miscalculated. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as Isabel turned her piercing gaze directly onto her. "Your behavior today has been nothing short of disgraceful," Isabel stated, her voice razor-sharp. "You humiliated yourself, mistreated a passenger, and tarnished the reputation of this airline." Claudia swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she stammered, I didn't know." A single raised hand from Isabel silenced her. "You didn't know," she repeated, her tone icy, "because you didn't bother to treat me, or any passenger, with basic respect. Instead, you made assumptions, let your prejudice guide your actions, and escalated a situation that could have been handled with professionalism and decency." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. The passengers, once silent and unsure, now exchanged knowing glances, their faces reflecting newfound admiration for the woman they had unknowingly underestimated. Mr. Caldwell, the older gentleman seated in first class, neatly folded his newspaper and gave Isabel a firm nod of approval. The shift in power was undeniable. Claudia's eyes darted around, desperate for support, but she found none. The businessman across the aisle, who had watched the entire ordeal, crossed his arms in quiet judgment. The socialite, who had initially sneered at Isabel, now looked embarrassed, suddenly realizing she had backed the wrong person. Even Grace, the young flight attendant who had hesitated to intervene earlier, stood with her head held high, no longer afraid to be on the right side of the situation. For the first time, Claudia felt truly alone. Isabel took a measured step forward, her gaze locked onto the trembling flight attendant. "While you were busy judging me," she continued, "you failed to do your job. A flight attendant's duty is to ensure the safety and comfort of every passenger, regardless of how they look or where they come from. And now there are consequences." Claudia's breath hitched. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to grasp at some excuse that would undo what had just happened, but no words came. She felt the walls closing in. Isabel turned to the pilot, her authority unmistakable. "I want this matter handled immediately," she ordered, "and I want assurances that nothing like this will ever happen again on my airline." The pilot, his posture rigid with professionalism, gave a curt nod. "Understood, Miss Harrington." Claudia instinctively took a step back. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to get off this plane before things got worse. But as she turned, the pilot stepped in her path, blocking her exit. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his tone final. Panic gripped her chest. Isabel's expression didn't waver. "Claudia," she said smoothly, "your actions today have made it clear that you are unfit for this position. Effective immediately," she paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, "you are fired." The finality of it hit Claudia like a slap. Her knees nearly buckled. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "Miss Harrington, I didn't mean—" Isabel's expression remained stone cold. "You didn't mean to get caught," she corrected, her tone cutting like steel. "But you did. And now you will face the consequences." At that moment, two uniformed police officers stepped onto the plane, their presence sending a fresh wave of murmurs through the passengers. Claudia's face turned a ghastly shade of white as they approached. "Miss Harrington," one of the officers addressed Isabel with respectful formality, "we received your report. Are you pressing charges?" Isabel didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said firmly. "This individual assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. I expect her to be held accountable." A strangled gasp left Claudia's lips. "Wait, wait," she cried, her voice high-pitched with desperation. "This is a misunderstanding." The officer didn't waver. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent." Claudia barely heard the rest. The sharp click of the handcuffs snapping around her wrists echoed through the cabin. Tears streamed down her face as she turned, wide-eyed, to Isabel. "Please," she sobbed. "I'm sorry." But Isabel remained impassive. "Your apology means nothing without accountability," she said quietly, her voice carrying more power than 1,000 shouted words. "You made your choices. Now you'll face the consequences." The passengers watched in stunned silence as Claudia, once so arrogant and untouchable, was led down the aisle in handcuffs. As the tension began to fade, Isabel turned to face the rest of the cabin. Her voice, now steady and measured, carried a different kind of authority, the kind built not on intimidation, but on integrity. "To everyone here," she addressed the passengers, "I sincerely apologize for what you had to witness today. This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes. Moving forward, I will ensure that every passenger is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The police erupted. The sound filled the cabin, a wave of admiration and relief sweeping over the passengers. Mr. Caldwell clapped heartily, while his wife, who had remained quietly knitting throughout the ordeal, gave a small approving smile. Even the skeptical socialite who had initially sided with Claudia now nodded in appreciation. Then Isabel turned to Grace, the young flight attendant who had been the only one willing to stand against injustice, despite the risks. "Grace," Isabel said, her tone softening, "I noticed your professionalism today. You stepped up when it mattered." Grace's eyes widened and she straightened her posture. "You'll be hearing from my office about a promotion," Isabel finished. A stunned gasp left Grace's lips. "Thank you, Miss Harrington," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. Isabel gave a small smile before turning toward the exit, her assistant already waiting beside her. The tension that had once filled the plane had been replaced with something entirely different. Admiration. Justice had been served. And Isabel Harrington had set an example that no one on that flight would ever forget. Should she be forgiven, or should she face the full weight of her actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. A slow wave of relief spread through the cabin as the tension that had once gripped it melted away. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, some whispering to one another while others simply smiled, absorbing the gravity of what had just unfolded. From her seat near the aisle, the socialite who had been so eager to gossip leaned forward, her curiosity now replaced with admiration. "Miss Harrington, that was incredible," she blurted out, her voice brimming with newfound respect. Isabel turned to her, a warm but knowing smile touching her lips. "Thank you," she said smoothly. "Remember this moment, because standing up for what's right is always worth it." As Isabel stepped off the plane, the crisp air of the tarmac greeted her, the sky above painted in hues of gold and blue. A sleek black SUV stood waiting, its engine humming softly. The driver, standing by the open door, gave her a respectful nod. Her assistants walked beside her, briefing her on her next engagement, their voices blending with the distant roar of jet engines. Yet, despite the agenda that lay ahead, Isabel's thoughts lingered on the day's events. She had set out for an ordinary flight, yet she had left it having sent a message that would echo far beyond the confines of this plane. Later, in a high-profile televised interview, Isabel sat across from the interviewer, poised as ever. The bright studio lights illuminated her composed expression, her presence radiating quiet authority. The interviewer, captivated, leaned forward. "Miss Harrington, your story has gone viral. Millions have seen the way you handled this situation. What message do you want to send?" Isabel's gaze held steady, her voice, clear and resolute, cut through the air like steel wrapped in silk. "Respect is not a privilege, it is a right," she declared. "Everyone deserves dignity, no matter their appearance, their background, or what others assume about them. True leadership means setting that standard and ensuring it is upheld." The interviewer nodded, visibly moved. "And what would you say to those who face similar injustices, but don't have the platform you do?" Isabel's expression softened, yet the conviction in her voice never wavered. "I would tell them that strength comes from within. Even when the world tries to make you feel invisible, remember your worth. You don't need a title or wealth to demand respect. You just need to stand firm in who you are." Her words, simple yet powerful, resonated far beyond that studio. A few weeks later, Isabel boarded another flight. This time, the energy inside the cabin was entirely different. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, filled with an unmistakable air of genuine professionalism. The lead flight attendant greeted her with a bright, sincere smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Harrington. It's an honor to have you with us." Isabel returned the smile as she settled into her seat. The service was impeccable, the attention to detail flawless, but more importantly, the respect was there. As the jet roared down the runway and lifted into the sky, she gazed out the window, watching as the world below blurred into a sea of white clouds. A deep sense of peace washed over her. She had not just won a battle that day, she had changed something. The events of that flight had left a lasting imprint, not only on those who had witnessed them firsthand, but on everyone who had watched the story unfold. Isabel knew that injustice, when confronted head-on, could be transformed into a lesson, one that rippled far beyond the moment itself. She smiled to herself, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. This was just the beginning. With every decision, every policy, and every act of leadership, she was shaping a future where respect and kindness were the standard, not the exception. The plane soared higher, engines humming softly as it climbed toward its destination, and Isabel, seated at the helm of her vision, felt a quiet triumph that no turbulence could ever shake. Shortly after, Isabel released a public statement, one that would spark conversations across the world. Luxury, she stated in a heartfelt video that quickly went viral, is not about appearances. It is about the experience we create for everyone. Success isn't about wealth, it's about how you treat people. That's why I'm ensuring that every passenger, no matter who they are, receives the respect they deserve. Her words ignited a firestorm of discussion, inspiring people from all walks of life to examine their own behavior and biases. Hashtags like "Respect Above All" and "Isabel Harrington Vision" trended for days, sparking widespread reflection. Isabel had not just corrected an injustice, she had set a new standard. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because the more people who hear it, the more we can build a world where respect is given freely, not just to those who look the part.